Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
All right. Okay, so everyone settle down. Get out your dice. All right, let's see. Dave, your character had 3 hit points last time when we ended. Gina, you were going to pray and see if you got your spells back. So you could heal David up. You ready to go? Okay. All right, I'll stop.
Please don't.
All right, so welcome everyone, especially welcome to the Muggles who have no idea what on earth I was just talking about. Welcome to the Microsoft Researchers Visiting Speaker Series. Our speaker today is David Ewalt. He is an award-winning journalist and author of the book you've all seen, of Dice and Men. I'm glad I got that right. It's Mice and Men for you. Of Dice and Men, the story of Dungeons and Dragons and the people who play it. I'm one of those people. I am an uber D&D geek. My name is Jerry Darcy. I am a lead game designer at Microsoft Studios Publishing. Go Xbox. My first experience is cliched with D&D. I went over to my cousin's house when I was 8 years old and begged him to let me play. And him and his older friends were like, sure, but you get to play the cleric. So I got to sit back and watch them go through, keep on the borderlands and against the giants and everything else, and then heal them when they were all, done with fighting. But one of the reasons that I'm really excited to hear David speak is because over the years since then, in all the different games that I've played, from pickup games at Gen Con to long campaigns with friends, I've run into a huge variety of people. The appeal of D&D seemed to me to be something that crosses ethnicities and political beliefs and religious beliefs. It's a creative meritocracy where, it doesn't matter who you are in real life, a lawyer, a janitor, a doctor, a truck driver. When there's a dragon coming down the tunnel, if you've got the Holy Avenger and you're the paladin, it's go time. So one of the things I still do, I still play D&D with my friends from time to time. And actually one of my buddies has a 10-year-old son that he brings over. And so, of course, we make him play the cleric. And that was the time you got involved when you were 10 years old, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you have to play the cleric right off the bat?
Not in those early games.
Not in those early games?
I was
okay.
more aggressive back then.
Oh, all right, okay. Yeah, he missed out on the gaming circle of life there. But yeah, David got his start when he was 10 years old, playing D&D. He's, I've spoken with him a little bit. He's one of us, avid gamer, and he's now a senior editor at Forbes magazine and an award-winning journalist. He's been on television, radio, and internet media. He's been on ABC's Good Morning America, NPR's All Things Considered, and CNBC's Closing Bell. So please join me in welcoming David Ewalt.
Well, I want to first thank everybody for having me. As Jerry was saying, usually when I come up, I've done a couple of these readings now with this new book, and usually when I come up, I introduce myself, I explain I am a writer, I write about games. So I've been here at Microsoft in the past. It's been, to visit, Xbox and things like that. And then I start this talk by saying I am a level 15 cleric. Or technically, I am a multi-class level 15 cleric, level 1 psychic warrior. And I do that because I look out at the crowd when I'm saying that, and I wait to see whose eyes are glazing over. And I'm like, okay, those are the people I really have to work for. But coming here, I know, okay, these, like Jerry says, these are my people. So I know, I can start at level 2. I don't have to begin with the cantrips and stuff like that with you guys. So, I have the familiar story. I did start playing D&D when I was a kid. I played a lot when I was young. And it was an important game to me, not just because it was so much fun, it was so much fun, but it was my main connection with my friends. The kids that I knew growing up who are my closest friends were my D&D friends. So I played a lot when I was in elementary school and high school, and then kind of went away from the game for a while and didn't play role-playing games for well over a decade. Then when I started writing about games for a living again, one of the things I did is as I would meet people in the game business, whether they were designers or developers or artists or executives, I would say to them, so what made you want to make games for a living? And over again, people would say to me, oh, well, I played a lot of Dungeons & Dragons when I was a kid. So that made me realize there's something to this game. It was more than just some fun thing that I did when I was a kid. And so I started playing again, trying to figure out why was this game so important, why was it so influential, and why did it have this profound influence on the modern game business. So what I want to do here today is two things. One is I'm going to read a little bit from the book and kind of go over the early history of Dungeons & Dragons, really where the game came from. Some of you might have heard these stories, but for me, I always played the game and never really knew the history. I didn't realize where D&D fell in the history of gaming and sort of what it popped out of. But after I do the reading, I want to save a bunch of time for questions, because I would love to not only be able to answer your questions if you want to ask about the history of D&D or the significance of it, but also hear what you think. Because I know that there are some minds in this room that have thought a lot about Dungeons & Dragons, have thought a lot about the campaigns you've been in, and that even have some cool stories from your favorite campaigns. So think about your favorite anecdotes and stuff, and I want to hear some of those when I finish up reading. So first thing, I want to give you sort of a 60-second sort of basic ancestry of war games, which are the games that really gave birth to Dungeons & Dragons. In the book, I start by going as far back as chess, which is, on a very basic level, it is a war game. Chess is a game where you've got pawns and knights and the king all on a battlefield. And it is recreating this famous battle that happened in India several thousand years ago. It was a very abstract approach to simulating a war game, though. It was more about sort of demonstrating an idea. You weren't laying out the armies as they actually appeared on the battlefield, but what you were doing is demonstrating a fundamental truth about war, which is that you win by controlling space. It's not so much about, I took your knight. It's about, I'm going to control the center, I'm going to left flank in. It was sort of teaching this fundamental level that war is about controlling the board, controlling the place where you're fighting. So chess grew over the years. As time passed, it actually became more war game-like. Variants came in where now there'd be more figures. Instead of just knights and pawns, there would suddenly be infantrymen. There would be halberdiers. There would be cannons. And the board grew too. There were variants of chess that had as many as 1,000 squares on the board. And they were still played similarly, where you're pushing the pieces from square to square, and each piece had their specific move. But even that was too limiting. So over time, the game evolved even further into what we think of as more modern war games, where if you've seen if you've seen movies like Patton, and they're pushing tanks around a geography, they have a sand table maybe, or a different a map with rivers and things on it, and they're pushing little soldiers around the board. That's evolved out of chess too, and the idea there was to really test out tactics of war and simulate what happens on the battlefield. These games got really complicated, as you can imagine, because they were still trying to say this is war, but your tank can only move 3 inches. Your infantryman can only shoot 1.5 inches. So at some point during the development of these games, some very smart person said, you know what, this is not working. We need a referee. So the games now had a new factor come in, and this was a person who's not even playing, is kind of standing by the side and saying, all right, I'm going to come in, and when there's an inevitable argument over rules, I'm going to be the guy to tell you, who's right and who's wrong. War games became very important during the Prussian Empire and the Franco-Prussian Wars. There was a game called Kriegspiel that became so popular that soldiers would carry it around in their backpacks. Officers, it became a part of the training regimen for officers. And after those wars were over, the success of Otto von Bismarck on the battlefield was widely attributed in part to this war game that he and his commanders had drilled through this so many times and simulated so many battles that they suddenly had a greater insight about what would actually happen in the real world when they fought. At the beginning of the 20th century, these games were still very popular in the military but hadn't really gotten out into the mainstream. The author H.G. Wells, who many of you probably know as a science fiction author, was a big fan of war games. So he developed one called Little Wars, and it was his attempt to democratize these very militaristic and frequently super complicated games. He meant for it to be a product that anybody at home could take home and play, even for kids. And his idea was, I'm going to write this short little book that has the rules for a war game, but you'll take it home and you'll play it with like your toy soldiers. He literally wanted the tin soldiers that kids had in their house. Those would be the pieces that you use on the board. That was really important because that then took war games out of just these martial situations and brought them into people's houses. And war games became really popular in Europe in the first part of the 20th century. In the mid part of the 20th century, they spilled over more and more into the United States, in part because a lot of soldiers who had gone over to Europe during the two world wars brought them back with them. And some of them played the same games that they had learned in Europe, games like Kriegspiel. There were also people here in the US who invented their own games. There were some very popular games made by a company called Avalon Hill, for instance, which is sort of still around as a brand. And you've probably seen some of their games, including Gettysburg, which was a very influential game that was a simulation of the Civil War battle. These games were still popular in niche audiences. So what you saw was hobbyist groups around the country, sort of coalescing, usually around colleges, but all over the place. They'd get together, and every couple of nights or once or twice a week, these people would come together with like-minded people and simulate these battles, these naval battles and Napoleonic War battles. And there was something else happening at the same time. In the 60s and 70s, there was sort of a seed change in American thought, and people are becoming more entrepreneurial and thinking more about breaking down systems and recreating them. So that's sort of where we start this excerpt that I'm going to read, is that you've got these gaming groups across the country that have these relatively old and staid war games and are starting to look at them and say, how can we break this and rebuild this and create something new with it? One of the largest wargaming groups in the US was the Midwest Military Simulation Association, based in Minneapolis, St. Paul. Founded in 1964 by a small group of amateur historians, miniature modelers, and gamers, it grew quickly as war games became more popular. Before long, the meetings were crowded and increasingly contentious as the old problem of bickering over rules reared its head. A solution was found in the form of an 80-year-old Army training manual, Strategos, a series of American games of war, published in 1880 by Charles A.L. Totten, a lieutenant in the 4th United States Artillery. Dave Wesley, an undergraduate physics student at St. Paul's Hamline University, unearthed the book in the University of Minnesota Library and rediscovered the centuries-old idea of an all-powerful referee. It quickly became standard practice. By 1970, the association had about 60 members and had grown so big that it fractured. Wesley and the rest of the young wargamer crowd coalesced around the home of David Arneson, a University of Minnesota student. They'd meet several times a week to play out traditional Kriegspiel-style Napoleonic battles and board games including Avalon Hill's Gettysburg, Parker Brothers' wargame Conflict, Milton Bradley's Cold War simulator Summit, and a French game known in the US as Risk. In the fall, Wesley left the Twin Cities to attend graduate school in Kansas. Away from his gaming friends, he had months to plan something memorable for his return home over winter break. What he came up with was the first modern role-playing game. The scenario was set during the Napoleonic Wars in the fictional town of Braunstein, Germany, surrounded by opposing armies. But Wesley didn't put the armies on the board. Instead, he assigned each player an individual character to control within the scenario. Some players controlled military officers visiting the town. Others took non-military roles, like the town's mayor, school chancellor, or banker. Wesley then gave each player their own unique objective, forcing them to consider motivations for their actions and to think beyond battlefield strategy. The game quickly spun out of control. Players wanted to do things Wesley hadn't planned for, like duel each other, so he had to make up rules on the spot. They also wandered away from the table in small groups to hold secret negotiations, a supposedly all-powerful referee's nightmare. So Wesley returned to school thinking the game had flopped. But the players felt otherwise. Before long, they were begging Wesley for another Bronstein. He obliged by designing new scenarios, like the one set in 1919 amid the Russian Civil War. Another explored a Latin American dictatorship through the eyes of student revolutionaries, secret policemen, and corrupt government functionaries. David Wesley's innovations, using a referee, assigning players individual characters with unique objectives, and giving them the freedom to do what they want, lit a fire in the Twin Cities gaming community. His Bronstein role-playing adventures appealed to players who were tired of long, complicated war reenactments and got them thinking about where games could go next. It wasn't long before others began to follow his example. David Arneson was born in 1947 and grew up in St. Paul, Minnesota. When he was a teenager, his parents bought him a copy of Avalon Hill's Gettysburg, and he got hooked. Later, he moved on to the hardcore stuff, including Civil War simulations and Napoleonic naval battles. Upon enrolling at the University of Minnesota to study history, he joined the Midwest Military Simulation Association to further indulge the habit, and his basement game room, a small space dominated by a ping pong table with just a few feet of clearance on each side, became home base for the role-playing game crowd. Seated on a cushy couch throne at the head of that ping pong table, Arneson began making his own refinements to traditional wargame rules, mostly by breaking them. During one battle, set amid the Roman conquest of Britain, he got bored and decided to spice things up. I'd given the defending brigands a druid high priest, Arneson explained in a 1983 interview. In the middle of the battle, the dull battle, when the Roman war elephant charged the Britons and looked like he was going to trample half their army flat, the druidic high priest waved his hands and pointed this little funny box out of one hand and turned the elephant into so much barbecue meat. Arneson removed the war elephant from the game, explaining that the druid had killed it with a Star Trek-style phaser gun. That was absolutely the only thing in the game that was out of the ordinary, but they weren't expecting it, he said. The players were nonplussed, except for the delighted commander of the British Druid. But Arneson wasn't put off from sneaking elements of fantasy into his war games. In December 1970, after a 2-day binge of watching monster movies and reading Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian books, Arneson invited his friends over under the pretense of playing a traditional Napoleonic wargame. Instead, he introduced them to the city of Blackmore. They came down to the basement, and there was a medieval castle in the middle of the table, says Wesley's friend David McGarry. And then he says, "We're going to do this instead." The players, Arneson explained, had been sent through time and space to a medieval city and had to control original heroic characters, each with their own attributes, powers, and goals. "My very first character was a thief," says McGarry, "and my nemesis was Dan Nicholson, the merchant. His role was to try to get stuff into town and then sell it, and my role was to try to steal his stuff and make my money that way. It gave us a framework of how to operate in this world." Characters in place, Arneson sent the players to explore the dungeons beneath the castle and town. Inside, he hit them with another twist. The subterranean passages weren't defended by human soldiers, but inhabited by fantastic monsters, like a dragon, which Arneson represented on the table using a plastic toy brontosaurus with a fanged clay head. The fantasy role-playing game was born. At first, combat in the world of Blackmore was resolved using a clunky system of rock, paper, scissors showdowns. But Arneson quickly turned to the rules of a medieval miniatures wargame called Chainmail, paying in particular interest to 2 sections of its 60-page booklet. Man to Man, which explained how to manage individual heroes amongst your army, and the Fantasy Supplement, which included rules for casting magical spells and fighting hideous monsters. Chainmail provided a framework that helped Blackmore develop from a novelty into a consistent, ongoing game. But ultimately, the system proved too limited for Arneson's growing fantasy world. He began adding his own innovations, like rules for fighting and different types of armor, lists of magical artifacts, and provisions for improving a character over time. Like any passionate hobbyist, Arneson was excited to share his work with others, so he decided to show off Blackmore to Chainmail's author. Ernest Gary Gygax grew up playing games. Born in Chicago in 1938, he knew pinochle by age 5 and chess by 6. His grandfather would challenge him to matches, checkmate him, start the game over at the point where Gary had made his biggest mistake, and then repeat the process until the boy's play was perfect. When he was 8, the family moved out of the city, in part because mischievous Gary had been involved in a 40-kid rumble, to the quiet resort town of Lake Geneva, Wisconsin. Gary passed his time there playing board games and cards. At 10, he discovered Avalon Hill's Gettysburg. "That sealed my fate," he later wrote, "for thereafter I was a wargamer." As an adolescent, he got hooked on military miniatures battles, and even built his own sand table. He also loved fantasy. When Gygax was a boy, his father, a Swiss immigrant, put him to bed every night with tales of wizards and warriors. He picked up the Brothers Grimm as soon as he could read, mastered Poe before he was 10, and devoured the amazing stories in pulp magazines like Weird Tales, Argosy, and Blue Book. Gygax found a favorite in the works of Robert E. Howard. Bright and highly literate, Gygax had little interest in formal education and dropped out of high school in his junior year. Later, he attended junior college classes and toyed with the idea of becoming an anthropologist, but his childhood interest had instilled an undeniable ambition to write and design games. He took a job as an insurance underwriter to support his gaming habit, and then a growing family. In 1958, he married an attractive redhead named Mary Jo Powell, and they eventually had 5 kids. In 1966, Gygax became a founding member of the United States Continental Army Command, a club whose impressive name belied the fact that its members were engaged in a play-by-mail campaign of the strategic wargame Diplomacy. A year later, the group changed its name to the International Federation of Wargaming, and its focus to promoting the hobby. To that end, Gygax decided to organize a wargaming convention. He rented out the Lake Geneva Horticultural Hall for $50, and on August 24, 1968, he welcomed friends and IFW members to Gen Con, a double pun referring to both the rules of war and the event's location. Admission cost $1, and the show made just enough money to cover the rental. In August of 1969, Gygax held the event again. This time, IFW member Dave Arneson drove from St. Paul to check out the action, and the two gamers spent a lot of time together. Since we're only talking a couple hundred people at this point, we pretty much ran into each other all the time, Arneson said. We were both interested in sailing ship games. Arneson had developed new rules for naval warfare simulations and showed Gygax his system. After the convention was over, they stayed in touch via phone and letters and shared ideas about how to make the game better. In 1970, determined to make a career in gaming, Gygax quit his job as an insurance underwriter and took a part-time job writing and editing rulebooks for D&DGÇÖs, a tiny publisher based in Evansville, Indiana. To supplement the meager income, he learned how to repair shoes and practice cobblery out of his basement. D&DGÇÖs barely lasted as long as a new pair of leather soles, but before it went belly up, it produced 2 games of particular importance. 1971's Chainmail, written by Gygax and his friend Jeff Perrin, which provided a starting rule set for Dave Arneson's Blackmore campaign, and 1972's Don't Give Up the Ship, authored by Gygax, Arneson, and wargaming friend Mike Carr, the result of their ongoing discussion about naval warfare. Based on his use of Chainmail and the successful collaboration of Don't Give Up the Ship, Dave Arneson knew what to do after he created the fantasy role-playing game Blackmore. He shared it with Gary Gygax. In the 4 decades that have passed since David Arneson and Gary Gygax began their most important collaboration, various geek pundits have attempted to describe, by way of analogy, the nature of their momentous and fateful partnership. I've heard them described as Paul McCartney and John Lennon, as James Watson and Francis Crick, and this is true even as John the Baptist and Jesus. Here's my attempt. Two young men meet in the late 1960s and bond over a shared love of a nerdy pastime. They both belong to the same hobbyists club and start making things to share with the other members. Before long, they're working on something new and exciting. One of them is the engineer. He invents new ways of doing things. The other is the visionary. He realizes the potential. The product they create could not have existed without both of them. When it's released, it helps launch a brand new industry and changes the world. The story's the same whether you base it in the International Federation of Wargaming or the Homebrew Computer Club, where Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs helped jumpstart the personal computer industry by founding Apple Computer. Wozniak, the engineer, designed the hardware and made the computer function. Jobs, the visionary, made it user-friendly and something people wanted. Arneson visited Lake Geneva in the fall of 1972 to show off his Blackmore game, but what he really delivered was innovations. Every player at the table controls just one character. Those characters seek adventure in a fantasy landscape, and by doing so, they gain experience and become more powerful. Gary Gygax took those ideas and turned them into a commodity. Over the next 2 months, Gygax labored at a portable Royal typewriter, crafting the rules for a new kind of game, where players roll dice to create a hero, fight monsters, and find treasure. By the end of 1972, he'd finished a 50-page first draft. He called it the fantasy game. The first people to play it were Gygax's 11-year-old son, Ernie, and 9-year-old daughter, Elise. Gygax had created a counterpart to Arneson's Blackmore, which he called Castle Greyhawk, and designed a single level of its dungeons. One night after dinner, he invited the kids to roll up characters and start exploring. Ernie created a wizard and named him Tensor, an anagram for his full name, Ernest. Elise played a cleric called Alyssa. They wrote down the details of the characters on index cards and entered the dungeon. In the very first room, they discovered and defeated a nest of scorpions. In the second, they fought a gang of kobolds, short subterranean lizard men. Of course, I realize when I'm talking to a group like this, I don't have to tell you what kobolds is, do I? They also found their first treasure, a chest full of copper coins, but it was too heavy to carry out. The two adventurers pressed on until 9 o'clock, when the dungeon master put them to bed. Fatherly duties completed, Gygax returned to his office and designed another level of the dungeons. The next day, the playtest continued, and Ernie and Elise were joined by 3 players plucked from Gygax's regular wargaming group, his childhood friend Don Kay, and local teenagers Rob Kuntz and his brother Terry. He also sent the manuscript to a few dozen wargaming friends around the country. The reaction was instant enthusiasm, wrote Gygax. They demanded publication of the rules as soon as possible. The local gamers also clamored for more. As they got farther into the depths of Castle Greyhawk, they faced greater challenges and began to feel like they were part of a legend. Thanks to Dave Arneson's innovation of persistent characters, the dungeons had a living history. If Tensor killed a pack of kobolds on Tuesday, someone else might find the corpses on Thursday. It was a brand new way to create a story. Gygax began running regular sessions of the fantasy game for a growing group of players. Simultaneously, David Arneson tried out the rules with his Blackmore players in St. Paul. Arneson and Gygax spent a year testing the fantasy game with their respective gaming clubs and then discussing what did and didn't work. I don't know if any game has ever been play-tested as much as this game, says Michael Bernard, the only person to play a regular character in both Gary Gygax's Greyhawk campaign and Dave Arneson's Blackmore. Gary Gygax's early Greyhawk sessions were understandably surprising to players like Mike Bernard, who'd never seen this brand new thing called a fantasy role-playing game. But they would also look different to today's experienced D&D players. There was no common gaming table. The players sat together, and Gygax sat alone at his desk. The ways Gary's study was arranged, he had a desk with a filing cabinet next to it, and he pulled out the drawers on the filing cabinet so we couldn't see him, says Menard. What you did was listen. You heard his voice. All the action took place entirely inside our heads. If you wanted a map, you drew one yourself. There wasn't much talking either. Each party had a caller who spoke for the group. Players quietly discussed their actions and then told the caller, who told Gygax. If someone talked too much, they risked missing an important announcement coming from behind the filing cabinet. The tension in the room was palpable, says Menard. There were no set adventuring parties, nothing like Frodo's Fellowship of the Ring. During playtesting, Gygax ran the game for 3 to 5 players each time, drawn from a pool of about 20 people. We were adventurers who occasionally banded together, says Menard. He ran several games at several times during the week, and you got invites for certain times. I was usually on Thursday nights, but not invariably. And there were no piles of rule books, and not just because they hadn't been written yet. Gygax wanted his players to learn the game through experience. And because the game was so new, players never knew what to expect from their dungeon master or from their cohorts. Gygax was learning the game alongside his players and changing the rules based on their actions. Night after night, small groups of players pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Their actions shaped Gygax and Arneson's work and decades of games that followed. After the better part of a year spent playing in Gary Gygax's fantasy game playtests, Menard moved to Minneapolis to start college at the University of Minnesota. Naturally, he made friends with the local gamers and soon found himself in Dave Arneson's basement. Perhaps because the Blackmore players were more often college-aged and less often neighborhood children, Arneson's games were less playful than Gygax's. Blackmore was a much grimmer, grittier place than Greyhawk, says Menard. In Greyhawk, if you were killed, the other players would drag your body home. But in Blackmore, there was no honor amongst thieves. You'd be looted before your body hit the ground. The game played a little differently, too. It was a different way of interacting, says Menard. Arneson liked to use miniatures, while Gygax rarely did so. Arneson used to draw maps for his players instead of insisting they do so themselves. And he made people write up their moves instead of shouting them out and talking them over each other. Based on feedback from playtests in Blackmore and Greyhawk, and from wargamer friends across the country, Gygax completed a 150-page revision of the fantasy game in the spring of 1973 and sent it out to more friends for testing. The reaction was so intense that I was sure we had a winning game, he wrote. I thought we would sell at least 50,000 copies to wargamers and fantasy fans. I underestimated the audience a little. So the demand was there, the game worked, the only thing missing was a name. Fantasy Game was a fine working title, but too bland for the final product. So Gygax created a list of words that related to the game and wrote them in 2 columns on a long sheet of paper. Words like castles, magic, monsters, treasure, trolls, mazes, sorcery, spells, and swords. He read them aloud to his players, including Ernie and Elise, to gauge their reactions. The young girl's delight at 2 of the words, an alliterative pair, confirmed the choice. The game would be called Dungeons and Dragons. Now they only had to print it. In the summer of 1973, Gygax called Avalon Hill and asked if they were interested in publishing his game. They laughed at the idea, turned it down, Gygax wrote. Most of the gaming establishment wanted nothing to do with Arneson and Gygax's weird little idea. One fellow had gone so far as to say that not only was fantasy gaming up a creek, wrote Gygax, but if I had any intelligence whatsoever, I would direct my interest to something fascinating and unique, the Balkan Wars, for example. No matter. The Dungeon Master wanted to choose his own adventure. Gygax had aspirations to run his own company, he just didn't have the money to start one. At the time, he was ready to start printing game books, but Gygax's income came from repairing shoes in his basement, and Arneson was a security guard who couldn't afford shoes. The solution was found in the place where the whole project started. In August, the annual Gen Con convention, now in its 5th year and bigger than ever, was held in several buildings on the campus of George Williams College, up the road from Lake Geneva in a town called Williams Bay. Members of Gygax's ever-growing D&D playtest flocked to the con and caught the eye of one of Gygax's old friends. Don Kay saw the turnout and noted the interest of fans, and after the event was over, he asked, "Do you really think you can make a success of a game publishing company?" Kay didn't have the cash to invest either, but after seeing the crowds at Gen Con, he was convinced D&D was a saleable product. So he borrowed $1,000 against his life insurance. And that October, he and Gygax became equal partners in a new company called Tactical Studies Rules. It was based out of Kay's dining room. There were still problems. $1,000 wouldn't print enough copies of D&D to meet anticipated demand. So Kay and Gygax decided to publish a different game first. Cavaliers and Roundheads, a set of rules for English Civil War miniatures battles, co-written by Gygax and his chainmail partner, Jeff Perrin. We published Cavaliers and Roundheads, hoping the sales of the booklet would generate sufficient income to afford to publish the D&D game soon thereafter, wrote Gygax. We both knew D&D would be the horse to pull the company, but the game raised only $700 in sales. Then the last piece fell into place. Another local gamer, Brian Bloom, had also been to Gen Con, seen the crowds of people, and badgered Gary into letting him in at the ground floor. Bloom was 23, divorced, and worked as a tool and die maker's apprentice at a company owned by his dad, Melvin Bloom. In December, he borrowed $2,000 from his father and became a full partner in Gygax and Kay's company. A few weeks later, Gygax sent his manuscript, now broken into 3 small booklets called Men and Magic, Monsters and Treasure, and Underworld and Wilderness Adventures, to graphic printing in Lake Geneva. He paid $2,300 to print 1,000 sets. In January 1974, Tactical Studies Rules made its creation public. It cost $10 and came in a hand-assembled cardboard box covered in wood grain paper. A flyer pasted to the top lid featured a drawing of a Viking warrior on a rearing horse, art copied from a Doc Strange comic book. Gygax and Arneson's names were also on the cover, and above that was the title, Dungeons and Dragons. Rules for fantastic medieval war games campaigns, playable with paper and pencil and miniature figures. So at this point in the history is where you guys come in. The game was a little slow to get started, at least from TSR's perspective. They sold a couple hundred copies in the first 6 months, but it grew exponentially. That couple hundred copies in the first 6 months turned into a couple thousand copies in the second 6 months, and tens of thousands of copies in the second year. And within a few years, the game was the hottest thing in the wargaming community. It didn't break out of the wargaming community truly, though, until around 1979. There was an infamous moment where a student, one of the places where the game had found traction outside of wargaming communities was at colleges, where like sci-fi groups, Tolkien fan groups and stuff found this game and was like, well, this is awesome. We love Lord of the Rings. Now we can be in Lord of the Rings. And there was a young student, a young genius named James Dallas Egbert. He graduated from high school early, he went to college a couple years early, and as often happens with young geniuses like this, he was alienated from other kids his age. He didn't have a lot of friends, they didn't understand him. When he went off to school, he managed to make some friends for the first time who were people who played D&D, connected with people on this common interest that they had. But eventually he had a depressive episode. He ran away from school. And when the police and his family investigated, went to his room to try to figure out what happened to him, they found these weird rule books that had pictures of demons on them, and monsters, and lists of spells. And you have to remember that at the time, no one had ever seen a game anything like this. So the police jumped to the conclusion that, oh, this kid is engaged in some weird satanic game and has either gotten killed or is lost somewhere in the steam tunnels under the university pretending that he's a wizard. He wasn't, of course. He had just run away. But that idea that D&D was satanic and dangerous got into the media. It became a national news story. It was reported all over the country, this salacious story of young genius ruined by satanic game. And you've probably heard the old adage that no publicity is bad publicity. That never proved more true than in the case of Dungeons & Dragons. Because the minute there was a game on the market that people were saying, this game is satanic and evil, everyone was saying, I want to play this game. So D&D's sales exploded. It wasn't just wargamers, it wasn't just college kids. There were now kids, adults of all ages playing this game. I talk a lot more in the book about what happened from there, how it became more popular, who played it, and why it became so influential. But what I would like to do now is take some of your questions, and I'd love to know more about these groups that started forming together after the game exploded. So many people made their friends that way. They decided, oh, I want to make games because of this. A lot of people decided, oh, I love just telling stories. I assume everybody in this audience has seen like the Avengers movies and the Iron Man movies. Jon Favreau, the director, says the reason why he's a director, that what taught him to tell a story, was playing Dungeons & Dragons. So any questions you have about the history, ask them now, and also anything you want to share, like if you have a similar story, I'd love to hear it.
Just curious, I don't recall you saying so. So you said you started playing when you were around 10 years old?
Yeah.
And at what point in the life of D&D was that? It's a clever way of asking you how old you are.
So, when I started playing, we were playing, the first game I played was the Keep on the Borderlands. It was the module that came with the red box basic D&D set. So this would have been in 1986 was when I started playing. The game was already big by then. By any standards, I was on the, I was past the peak maybe even, but it was real big with kids at the time. The basic set was one of these innovations that simplified the rules so much and made it something that 10-year-olds could understand. The rules that came before were pretty dense.
I started playing in high school. I graduated high school in 1981. I seem to recall playing it for a few years prior to my graduations. I remember buying the original 3 books. I don't remember what the box looked like, but I still have the original 3 books. And then the advanced D&D modules and a whole bunch of other crap that's sitting in a box in my basement now.
One of the things that's cool about this game is that it was kind of a universal experience for kids of a certain geeky mindset. If you were in school between like 1978 and 1988 and you were a geek, you played Dungeons & Dragons. Unless you were like in some, maybe if you were in a religious school where it was banned, you didn't play it, but you really wanted to play it and you had heard about it.
I'm kind of curious, I guess a slight background on the question. I actually stumbled on an article of yours on Forbes through dig.com or something. And I remember being really struck by, here's a guy writing about Dungeons & Dragons at Forbes. And the thing was, to me, I think it was a couple of years ago, I started playing about the same time as the previous person, around 79. And I remember sneaking on to SU campus to play with college students and all that. But it was not a very, once I started getting into it as a hobby, amongst my friends' parents, it was looked at with a lot of suspicion. And culturally, it was something that there was that game store in the crappy part of town that you went to buy the stuff. And slowly kind of got into Walden's books, but it was like one shelf tucked away in the back. And moving out here and seeing game stores and stuff like that, in the 90s, there was a big transition maybe with Magic the Gathering. But I mean, how do you view that in light of the popular culture at large? Because I don't think it's just that it was a geek hobby. There's a change in perception around things that people might have labeled as nerdy then to today. So.
Yeah, like the games. You can, if you talk to someone who's geeky and you ask them about like the games they play, you can put a finger like on exactly when they grew up. I was playing a lot of D&D in the late 80s and early 90s. I didn't just play D&D. We played a lot of other role-playing games. We played some D&D's children. We played stuff like Cyberpunk and Shadowrun. which were big games. Shadowrun was huge in the early 90s. White Wolf's games, like the Vampire, the Masquerade, games like that. But even then, at that time, I was sort of, as a subset of geek gamers, the role-playing game subset was fairly small at that point because video games were already exploding up. I mean, we were just talking about like the NES at that point, but if you were a gamer when I was in high school, that meant you played video games. You had a Sega. So D&D is interesting because it has persisted through many forms, but it stayed around for 40 years, even though it's been pushed out by, arcade games for a while, Pac-Man and things like that, and then console games. Today, I think it's a lot more about, of course, in gaming, you're talking about console and about online, but also when you go to a gaming store today, today's gaming stores have a couple shelves of role-playing games, and then they have 8 tables where people come every single night to play Magic the Gathering. Magic the Gathering and collectible card games are still what's paying the bills in the hobby and game world. D&D is still a great property. I mean, D&D got bought almost over 10 years ago. Wizards of the Coast that publishes Dungeons & Dragons was purchased by Hasbro. So big companies know that this is a valuable brand, but like you say, it has changed over time, and now Magic the Gathering has been for a long time. As far as Wizards of the Coast concerns, that's what pays their bills. It's the collectible card game.
So, not so much a question about history, but about the present and the future. You talked about how the thing that differentiated this from the rest of the wargaming industry was the fact that it was open-ended, as opposed to a fixed scenario and a fixed set of rules and so on. And so, as we moved later, then people started getting into video games and so on. So today, what do the kids do that are in that age group that are geeks and stuff? They play online games and stuff, which are not really open-ended so much. They're the World of Warcraft style stuff, which is sort of more like the wargaming stuff and less open-ended per se. And so there is the open-endedness still this niche thing that will always be persistent, but will always be niche, or is there something we can learn from that as to what should we look for today and in the future for the open-endedness versus the closedness?
Well, I think the fact that role-playing games are so open-ended and that you have true freedom of choice is now and will remain for a long time one of the defining arguments in favor of playing a game like D&D. There's plenty of really good and fascinating fantasy role-playing games for console and online that are very big, and you can have all kinds of possibility. I assume that there are plenty of people in this room who, just like me, got really addicted to Skyrim about 2 years ago. It was so big, you felt like you could go anywhere and do anything, but like, there was this mage in the beginning of the game. When you walked up to him, he said, wow, if you have the aptitude, you should go to the mages college. And I played for 40 hours, and then I came back to that mage, and I'm now the archmage. I'm the most powerful wizard in Skyrim. And he says to me, if you have the aptitude, you should really go check out the Wizards College. So that's, we're looking at a very long progression until video games can offer the true freedom of choice that you get in role-playing games. One thing that's interesting, though, is you talk about, like, kids today do play like World of Warcraft, or they play console games, to get that fantasy fix instead of role-playing games. While reporting this book and going to a lot of conventions, I see more and more young people who are coming into role-playing games and the tabletop games for precisely that reason, because they super enjoy fantasy games. They got really into World of Warcraft, and they're saying, I want more of this. And then someone's like, well, you should try Dungeons & Dragons. And when they try that for the first time and they realize, wait a minute, I can do anything, like literally anything, like they keep coming back and coming back. So the fandom is refreshing itself.
I was just going to mention that one of the things you see in video games these days is a lot of user-generated content, a huge phenomenon. The systems are still very clunky, but I think the more streamlined, the more easier, more easily accessible those things become, the more the idea of open-ended gaming can occur. But right now, it's just still too much of a learning curve for that to be tremendously prevalent.
Yeah, and there's an interesting phenomenon there too. If you look at like the success of games like Minecraft, I think what you're seeing there is people enjoy constructing a world, and Minecraft has given people the facility to very easily, I can make a castle, I can shape this fantasy landscape. And a lot of kids who are into Minecraft, when they realize, oh wait, there's a game where I'm not limited by these 12 different kinds of blocks, and it's not these big clunky graphics where I have squares for fists, it's as high definition as I can imagine, like that's very appealing to people. There's another question back here.
Regarding this World of Warcraft stuff, back in Brazil, I mean, I live in Brazil, so back there we are not playing Dungeons and Dragons anymore, especially because the 4th edition. The criticism we have about it is that it looks too much like World of Warcraft, but in a board. So we are like playing the 4th thing, like the Pathfinder, I guess it's the name. It's not a TSR stuff or Wizard of the Coast stuff. So what exactly do you feel or do you know about this? Is there like an idea of going back to not making it very systematic and very mathematical thing like the 4th edition is?
Yeah, actually, do you have any idea of what is the breakdown? Because like I never played 4th edition. I mean, it looks like crap. I mean, it really does. It's like very single courses, right? Like in the early ones, you pick all these different spells, and I mean, your variability in construction had infinite permutations, and it feels like the permutations on the 4th edition were terrible.
So the
I don't want to overwrite.
No, yeah,
do we know what the percentage breakdowns are of the editions?
We don't know, and it's a complicated question. Even Wizards of the Coast doesn't know, because it breaks down like this. So we're now working on the 5th edition of Dungeons and Dragons. The problem and the opportunity here is that you have a lot of people who bought the original white box D&D set in 1975, and they still play that. They don't exist on a database somewhere. They're not a known entity in Wizards of the Coast's marketing spreadsheets, but they're still out there. And then there was Basic D&D, Advanced D&D, Advanced D&D 2nd edition, 3rd edition, 3.5, 4th edition. Each edition was a new attempt to do two things. One, you put out a new release, that gives people something to go buy again. We've changed the rules. Your old stuff doesn't work anymore. You have to come get this new stuff. It also addressed different play styles. So a lot of the controversy you hear here, and that is just omnipresent among role players, is that 3.5 edition was a very sort of hardcore role player friendly system. It had a lot of complexity to it. It allowed you to play all sorts of games with the rules and do really creative stuff with the rules. It's a kind of thing it's kind of rule set that appeals to people who are like computer programmers. It's very sort of, there's an element of code to it almost. But that is not the sort of thing that is inviting to brand new players. So when Wizards of the Coast started working on 4.0, they saw, well, what are people playing? Instead of playing D&D, they're playing World of Warcraft, they're playing EverQuest. And so they came up with what some people have criticized as video gamey mechanisms. I'm not criticizing them. I've played 4.0. I find it fun too. It's just fun in a different way from other D&D games.
Well, I think that maybe they should accept that the more variable D&D is a smaller market, right? And it's a sucky business. I mean, it really is a sucky business. You publish a $20 book and the person gets 100 hours. What other thing, or 1,000 hours, 2,000 hours, right? There's no other market where you get the same dollar per hour of enjoyment. I mean, it's a bad business. D&D's a bad business.
So you should be working for Wizards of the Coast, because this is actually, they have come to this same conclusion at some point in the last few years. They're currently working on a new edition of Dungeons and Dragons. They've been playtesting it for about a year and a half. They're calling it D&D Next. And their intent there is they want at least to put the rules aside in a sense and make the game fundamentally about storytelling and exploration. They want the rules to be secondary. They're talking about doing things about, like they're describing the game as very modular. So sort of you buy the basic set, it has like sort of, here's your very basic fundamental rules of how to play the game. If you want to be really complex, if you want 3.5 style spellcasting, you can get a supplement for that. If you want to use miniatures and have like big army battles, you can get a supplement for that. So you can plug and play and make your own rules depending on whether you like 2nd edition play or whether you like basic play. And sort of the rules being something that we'll just publish them all, you make your rules. And what we're going to sell you going forward is going to be story. So what Wizards of the Coast is talking about a lot right now is, they've got this thing they're doing called the Sundering, which is in their fiction and in the game. And basically it's them blowing up the fictional world of Dungeons and Dragons so that they can start fresh. And when they release the new game, presumably sometime next year, after the rules come out, I think a lot of the product you're going to see from them is going to be them selling, well, here's an adventure that we wrote for you. Like, here's a module you can do with your friends. Here's a novel. Here's our R.A. Salvatore book that sort of takes place within this frictional universe. It becomes more about selling the fantasy brand of Dungeons & Dragons and less about, well, here's another rule book telling you how to use psychic attacks underwater. Like, that's because it's not a sustainable business. Sure.
Just a quick comment on the internet's really changed this, because on the internet there are a whole bunch of spin-off games that are mostly capitalizing on a Supreme Court decision about rules or the ability to trademark rules. And so there are a lot of D&D light systems out there that are basically rehashing old content and old editions. And so the other person's comment about Pathfinder, which is the system you're talking about, Paizo's a local company, and they basically made their brand on the basis of what you're describing that 5th edition is supposed to be, which is they do a lot of content production and adventure path production and bringing in very high-end art to kind of give people that inspiration, but the rules are fundamentally 3.5.
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of really interesting indie role-playing games out right now. If you haven't tried any of them, I recommend getting online, poking around, finding some. I mean, Pathfinder is a great example, but Pathfinder's kind of like, they're huge at this point too. They're in a couple different places, but also like Pathfinder isn't really indie even at this point. I'm going to take a quick second to tell you about this game I can't seem to stop talking about, but there's an indie game called Dread. It's free. You go on the internet, you download it, you actually download the adventure, so you don't really need anything. You invite some friends over for a party and you run this game for them. Dread is a horror role-playing game. So each little module you download simulates like a different kind of horror movie. So one would be like teenagers go to spend the night in a haunted house. The other one is, they're all out in the woods at the abandoned camp, that sort of thing. But the reason why it's cool is because the people who do Dread decided all this talk over rules is really stupid. The story's what's important. So there really are no rules for Dread. There's one gameplay mechanic. And the one gameplay mechanic is at the center of the table when you're sitting playing the game. Instead of having dice or charts or rule books, you have a big tower of Jenga blocks. You set up Jenga. And because it's a horror game, as you get further into the story and like people start dying and getting picked off, every time you have to do something that would require a roll, you pull a Jenga block. And so at the end of the game, like, it's super tense. You're watching this tower and like your decisions, the physical manifestation of the horror in the game, you feel it as you're pulling blocks out of that tower.
Scariest night of my life.
It is a lot of fun. And it's a great game for people who've never tried role-playing before, because like, put a polyhedral die in front of somebody who doesn't know role-playing games, they're going to be like, no. But Jenga, like, that's nice and accessible. Your grandma plays Jenga. I mean, that's not a hard one. So I think we have time for a few more questions.
I had a really quick comment, actually. That box you mentioned, the white box, is on display at the EMP that's in Seattle Center. So if you want to go see it, it's there, fancy of it, which is just really cool.
And if you happen to be digging through, like, grandfather's attic or something like that, or see it at a garage sale, those original white boxes, some of them are worth thousands of dollars depending on the condition. They're very valuable.
So when you're interviewing the creators of Dungeons & Dragons, I imagine they're reluctant to talk about Tolkien as an influence, but do you sense that he was a strong influence?
Well, I'll say up front that I didn't talk to Gygax because Gygax died in 2008. But Gygax talked a lot about Tolkien in his writing and in interviews elsewhere because it's an obvious comparison. Like, people would always say, oh, so how much of this did you steal from Tolkien? Gygax always contended that he was not influenced by Tolkien. He says he was influenced by guys like Howard, by like the Conan books. He says he was really influenced by guys like Michael Moorcock and other fantasy writers. He claims that the only time he ever really sort of tapped into Tolkien was just as a marketing thing, because Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit were really big, like on college campuses at the time. But he says they weren't direct influences. That flies a little bit in the face of the fact that the first early versions of D&D, like, you could be a hobbit, literally hobbit. And they were sued by the estate of J.R.R. Tolkien, saying like, well, you can't call things hobbits and ents and things like that, because those are ours, those are in the book, and they removed those from the book, which is why now if you play D&D, you don't play a hobbit, you play a halfling. It's because the Tolkien estate sued TSR.
Yeah, I don't remember what version it was, but at the very front it said, you guys need to remember, as the players and the DM both, this is merely a guideline, and the DM can change the rules as he sees fit. I've always played that way. I've even had to have Zeus come down and zap players that just wouldn't listen.
The game is at its best when there is a dungeon master who knows what he's doing, and when the players are more concerned with story than what they are with, rules lawyering. It stops the game when somebody's like, no, you can't do that because on page 67 of the Wilderness Adventure supplement, I mean, very few people want to play that way. And that's some of what Wizards of the Coast is talking about with the new edition, is they want to put power back in the hands of the DM and not have it written down in 16 million different books.
Yeah, I was reading a book called Masters of Doom, id Software Founders, and I remember middle of the book, D&D played a big part of the whole story of those guys, and middle of the book, there was a game where I think Carmack was playing the Dungeon Master, and he killed everybody. It was a very kind of pivotal point in the book. I always wondered how that kind of, and you mentioned here how anthropology was kind of what this guy was originally interested in, and just how kind of that, I guess, interpersonal aspect of the game is so different than any other game.
Well, one of the things is that, D&D is a social game. You're sitting down at a table with 6 other people, 8 other people, instead of just, even like World of Warcraft is social, but you don't see people's faces, you can't smell them, which is often a factor in Dungeons & Dragons, let's be honest. I think the social aspect of the game is huge, and is probably the biggest reason why people enjoy it so much, is because you make friends. D&D is also one of these things that it does appeal to geeky kids. It appeals to kids who maybe are very smart, don't fit in with other kids their age, and so what's great about the game is if you're a kid who maybe doesn't have the best social skills or doesn't have a ton of friends, like it's an opportunity to sit down at a table. First of all, just be welcomed, because yes, we need more players. You always need more players. There's never enough players. But also, there's this mechanism where, all right, we're talking about a story. We have an adventure. This is our primary modus here. We're going to go kill this dragon. So we're going to talk about that now. And in the process, we're going to work together and we're going to do all this other stuff. We're going to get to know each other later. So we can skip all the small talk, all the awkward stuff when you don't have good social skills and you have to go be like, hi, and shake your hand and talk about the weather. No, sit down at the table and we'll play together, and that's how we'll get to know each other through the game. So you see a lot of great partnerships, like the guys who worked at id, who played D&D together, and it cemented them as a team. They had these relationships at the table, and it reinforced them. It happens all the time.
It's very interesting.
Over here.
When I was in Copenhagen, I had a mentor that was always busy, and one of the times when he was busy, I asked him what he's doing, and he said he's going to a wedding. So I thought it was a real wedding, but actually it was a LARP wedding, and what actually happened was he was playing an RPG game over a longer period of time. One of his friends got a damage over time fire spell, and he would have died in about a week or 2 if something wasn't being done then. And what he figured out from their local rulebook was that if you marry someone that has fire immunity, you gain their family traits. So, from a marketing perspective, LARPing might also be interesting because you can sell clothing or actual events to people where they can come and be part of a live Dungeons & Dragons event, or maybe with Bing glasses, you can look at someone and he would be dressed as the character he's actually playing.
I think there's a whole aspect of role-playing which has not really been explored that much yet, and which we're starting to get into now, which is the aspect of live performances and even as a spectator sport. And I'm sure a lot of you guys, who work at Microsoft Studios or work with Xbox.
Called plays.
But it's also, so actually this week, the end of this week at the Penny Arcade Expo in Seattle, one of the things they do every year at PAX is something called Acquisitions Incorporated, where the guys from PAX get up with Scott Kurtz, the cartoonist. In the past, Will Wheaton's been one of the players, and they sit on a stage, and about 5,000 people sit in the stands and watch them play Dungeons & Dragons. And they intentionally make the game funny, they joke, it becomes like more of a entertainment thing. They're playing for the crowd. but it's absolutely a spectator sport. And I can see, people will log on to Twitch and watch StarCraft for 10 hours. I don't see why people won't go somewhere and watch Dungeons and Dragons. Do we have time for one more, or should we? We'll take one more. Okay, over here.
Yeah, I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are on the fact that it's guys tend to get into that a lot more than women.
Sure. Well, this is something that's changing. I think it's a really important issue right now, but I think it goes to just there is a definite gender disparity in tabletop gaming and in D&D in particular. There are lots of women who play, but they are certainly the majority. I think that happens for a couple of reasons. One is probably just sort of socially and culturally. We don't encourage little girls to do the same thing we encourage little boys. How many girls do you think are told, hey, yeah, pick up a sword and go kill that goblin? It's not something you expect to tell a little girl to do. I think that sucks. I don't have any children, but if I have a daughter, you bet your ass I'm going to be teaching her how to play Dungeons and Dragons. There's also, just like any sort of subculture like this, there's also some unfriendliness. I've heard stories from women who play the game about how, they'll go to conventions and they'll feel a little harassed, they'll feel uncomfortable, and that's an exposure thing. I think that's another thing that changes over time as more girls enter the hobby. The guys who have social issues get more used to it, and I think everyone has to work to be as welcoming as possible and to make the game for everybody, because it's cooler when there's different people with different perspectives at the table. It works better. So if you have more questions, I'll be signing books. You can come ask me. You can also email me. I'm always available. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope to talk to you more in the future.